continuing our reading in Hellbent for Election by Phyllis Speshock, Chapter 5. We stood at once before a small frame house in the ratty end of a Midwest village. "This is where you were born, Hellbent?" Alexis asked, although of course he already knew. "Yes," I said, "and quite a hygienic birth it was, coming in at the closing of the midwife era and before the conception of socialized medicine and the periodic pilgrimages to the hospital. It was no small mark of privilege to have been delivered by a doctor. This was then the better end of the town, you see. Fine old houses near the business district, before the exodus to suburbia." "Would you like to go in and browse about?" he asked. "No," I said, watching two pygmy-sized ragamuffins frolic out of the grassless dust with a burry mongrel. "I think not." "Do you recall anything of living here?" "No, only that I had been told of the place and have had it pointed out to me. We moved from here when I was just past 2. "Well then," he said, "let's not dawdle." "Shall we walk?" I asked. "It isn't far, perhaps a mile to my second home." He sent me an amused glance. "I say, Hellbent, for a creature so steamed against sentimentality, you do have a mawkishness over the past. I dare venture the High Registrar was correct in his analysis of you, but don't worry. You'll see enough of this place before we're through." Presently we stood on the broad green lawn of the suburban farm where I had lived to young manhood. The house was large and square and plain. The farm, now worked, had been then a wilderness of enchantment through which Della and I romped and roamed and hidden and dreamed. For a fleeting instant, I fancied that I could hear again Delia's airy laughter as she ran through the fields with her white legs quite scratched and disreputable, and her black hair flowing out behind her like a wild stallion's mane. I could see her leaping and galloping ahead of me all the time and delighted over it, and falling at last to a breathless, ragged heap on the hill beneath the gnarled little crab-apple tree. She would say, waving her skinny young arms dramatically, "shall be quite wicked when I grow up. None of this religion for me, for wickedness begets good, just as good begets wickedness." "Tell me about her," Alexis said. "Tell me about Delia." I nodded, feeling sadness. "Della is my sister," I said. 5 minutes my senior and filled as a child with mystery and knowledge transfused from the public library, wisdom and disillusion drawn from our circumstances. Della was only her nickname. Her proper name was Deliberately. "I see," he said. "Deliberately Hellbent. What became of her?" I drew a long breath. "She grew," I said. "She became a beautiful woman, cold and determined. She married. Her husband's name is Non-Regenerate. A fine fellow, hard-working and upstanding, practices moderation, never argues politics or religion, good name in the community, never maudlin or fuddled, knows where he's going." "I dare say," Alexis mumbled. "But before you began talking about her, you were thinking about her. You were remembering a thing she said as a child. Wickedness begets good, as good begets wickedness. Have you any idea what she meant by that?" "Of course," I said. "She meant our parents. She watched wickedness grow out of good, and she felt as I do that where wickedness prevails, good must eventually come from it. If you have gone down as far is, then you must out of necessity either stabilize or rise up. The stabilization is good because it has reached the depths of bad and can get no worse. The rising up is decided improvement and happiness." "Marrying Non-Regenerate? It does not seem as if she fared so badly," he suggested. "Of course not. There is the proof of her theory. But what wickedness grew out of what good regarding your parents?" "Well," I said, In the beginning, they were both very, very good. They came from very, very good families. They belonged to very, very good churches. They were, in fact, distant cousins. There was no need for my mother to change her name when she married my father. Her name was Vex Hellbent, and his name was Taunt Hellbent. The problem arose out of all this very, very goodness. You see, they belonged to different churches. Now, one of them they decided must be the right one, but which one? She argued for her denomination. He argued for his. Her relatives came every Wednesday and argued her defense. His relatives came every Friday and argued his. Soon they were not speaking except on Wednesdays and Fridays when everyone shouted. Soon after that, they were not sleeping together. They wrangled about divorce as they wrangled about all else. They disregarded the guidebook altogether, and it regards the marriage union as a contract covering a lifetime, and that severance of such contract is no less than an outrage and should be resorted to only under extreme conditions and subject to continued continence thereafter, providing both members of the marriage or both halves of the one body are believers. My parents were believers. There is an exception, he mused. Ah, yes, I said, and I know that exception. But no fornication occurred here. At the time the subject came under debate, there was only hateful restraint. They divorced then? Not at all, not for years. But if they waived religious regulation, what was the impediment? There were two, Della and I, though by this time they had begun to cast about wondering how they had got us from the start. And it was still a denominational tangle, for you see, she would not have us reared in his church, and he would not have us reared in hers. We were therefore reared alternately in both, for as long as that lasted. And how did it terminate? With Delia's rebellion. At the age of 17, she ran off and married non-regenerate. And your parents did not have this annulled? Of course not. It was the escape both had longed for. Oh, they ranted mildly on mixed marriage, implying that Della was a believer, but I recall that she answered them quite smartly. By this time, she was sassing off to them at regular intervals. I recall that she tossed her head and yipped back, "If I started out from this moment on with but one goal in mind, that of making a mess of my life, I could in no way hope for the success you flaunted all these many years. Never mention your beliefs to me again. I am sick of you to vomiting over your mealy arguments on wine, water, vestments, Sabbaths, and the whole lot. I am positively, absolutely, and irrevocably finished with religion." And she went off to her husband's side and cleaved. And your parents? He asked. What became of them? Oh, they threw both religions out the window, divorced, remarried, moved off, and I haven't seen them since. And their relatives? Each so determined to be right? I chuckled. That's strange, too, I said. His relatives joined her church, and her relatives joined his. And you, Hellbent, what mark did this leave on you? Well, I said slowly, I decided that none of them could be wholly accurate. I decided that if there is a God at all, he could not be confined by any one set of boundaries or condensed into one neat little package and made available only to one single group. He must be huge and belong to anyone who seeks him. But of course, at the time, I knew only that I was homeless and that non-regenerate offered me a place at my twin's side, food, clothing, and shelter. And that's the end of chapter 5.